I was never a fan of theatrics, even when I took my vows. Faith, I always believed, did not require pomp, only quiet devotion and discipline. However, my years of priesthood taught me that the church attracts amazing people and unexpected stories. Some of them stick in your memory, remaining on your soul like oil that cannot be washed off. It all started gradually, as it often does. At the beginning of my career, I was assigned to a rural parish in the small town of Salem, Massachusetts. Despite its historical significance, modern Salem was a cozy place with narrow streets, old houses, and a small population that lived by its own unspoken rules. The peace was almost tangible, but it hid something unsettling. My arrival did not cause much of a stir. People greeted me with polite indifference, as if I were just another priest they had seen since childhood. Conversation stopped as I approached, and gazes were quickly averted. It seemed that they wanted me here, but at the same time they were wary. It was a strange feeling, but I try not to give it much thought. Life in Salem was simple, though a bit isolated. People here talked about their faith not loudly, but quietly, at kitchen tables or while walking through the narrow streets. I was concerned about this reticence, but I thought it was just part of the local culture. Gradually, however, I began to notice that there was some anxiety behind this outward calmness. One of the peculiarities of the city was their rules. At first I learned about them by accident, when I noticed that the residents turned off all the lights together on certain nights. No one explained why, and I, still young and inexperienced, was in no hurry to ask questions. However, it began to bother me more and more. One day, late at night, when I was about to go to bed, someone suddenly started knocking on the door of the parish house. The knocking was insistent, as if there was a person standing outside the door who had no right to delay. I opened the door and saw a man standing on the threshold with a frightened face, wearing a faded coat and a hat that was sliding to the side. His eyes betrayed a fear I had never seen in these parts before. It seemed that this night would be the beginning of something I could not predict. The city was hiding secrets, and I was on the verge of revealing them. A boy, no older than 10 years old, stood on the doorstep. His eyes were wide open and his breathing was ragged. He looked at me and, without waiting for questions, said quietly, "Father, it's here." Without giving me time to think, he grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the forest that stretched beyond the outskirts of the city. At the edge of the forest, we were met by his father, a thin man with a stern look. In his hands was a rifle, which he clutched as if it were the only thing standing between him and danger. He said nothing, just nodded and gestured for us to follow him. We went deep into the forest and came across a deer carcass, or what was left of it. The body was torn apart as if something had broken out from the inside. The ribs were sticking out in different directions, and the meat had dark traces of thick black mucus on it. The smell was metallic and putrid, as if decomposition had been accelerated tenfold. "Footprints," the man muttered, pointing to the ground. They were huge, with deep claw scratches and a strange shape, as if the creature that left them had never learned to walk upright. Before I could fully realize what I was seeing, a low growl rolled through the trees. The boy screamed, and his father raised his rifle, but the sound was cut off when something flew over us at incredible speed. I only caught glimpses of it, a leathery, elongated body and a face that wasn't a face, but rather a moving mass of disorganized parts. "Go back to the church," my father said firmly. I did not argue. We ran, and fortunately, the creature did not follow us. The next day, the man and the boy were gone. Their house was empty, Their belongings were still there, as if they had disappeared in the middle of the night. I did not ask the city about them. I did not want to hear the answers. A year later, a new confessional was brought to the church. The old confessional, with its warped wood and worn curtain, had served the church for so long that no one remembered when it had appeared. I should have gotten rid of it, but instead I left it in the pantry, guided by a strange sense of sentimentality. I began to regret this choice almost immediately. One evening, after I had closed the church, I heard a soft rustling coming from the barn. I wrote it off as mice and decided to look into it in the morning, but the sound didn't stop. It was getting louder, more like the sound of tearing fabric, accompanied by a soft whisper that I couldn't make out. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. The old confessional stood still, but its curtain moved as if caught in the wind. This was impossible. The room was hermetically sealed. There could be no draught. My heart was beating faster and faster as I got closer and pulled back the curtain. There was nothing inside. No mice, no sound source. Just an empty box. I let go of the curtain and turned to leave, but the whispering started again, louder and clearer. "Father." It was a woman's voice. I turned around. The curtain was open and a figure was sitting inside. A woman, her face pale and blurry, as if through frosted glass. Her lips were moving, but the words were coming out too fast, overlapping and blurring into chaos. I instinctively reached out, and when my fingers touched the wood, the image disappeared. The next morning, I burned the confessional. The whispers continued for 3 days. During my 5th year at this church, I met him, or it. I'm still not sure. At first glance, the man was unremarkable. He was middle-aged, neatly dressed, with a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. He often attended Mass, always sitting in the back row and leaving the church before communion. At first, I didn't pay attention to his habits until one evening he stayed after the service. He approached me with restrained coolness and asked to speak to me alone. In the office, he sat down across from me, hands folded in his lap. His gaze was empty, almost lifeless. With his first words, he immediately created an atmosphere of anxiety. He claimed to have seen me in a dream and hinted that I also knew him, even if I didn't realize it. His eyes were unusual black, without any hint of sparkle or reflection. When he smiled, I noticed that he had too many teeth in his mouth, as if nature had made a mistake. He spoke of being here for a long time, longer than me, longer than the city itself. I asked about the door he mentioned, but he just smiled wider. Something changed in his face for a moment, as if another grotesque face flashed over his features. Then he left without leaving an explanation. A week later, the basement of the parish was flooded with black, icy water, the cause of which was not clear. The church also had an attic, which I rarely went into. It was a cramped, gloomy place filled with forgotten things. That night, as I was writing the sermon, I heard singing. It was coming from above, faint and uncertain, like the attempts of an out-of-tune choir. Flashlight in hand, I climbed the narrow stairs. The closer I got to the attic, the clearer the singing became. The words sounded foreign, guttural, but melodic at the same time. I opened the door and froze. In the darkness of the attic, I could make out the fuzzy silhouettes of figures. There were dozens of them. They stood in straight rows, their faces turned toward me. Their features were indistinct, as if they had been sculpted from wax that had been too long near the fire. They swayed, singing, their movements unnatural, frightening. "Stop," I said, and the singing stopped instantly. One by one, the figures turned and walked toward the far wall. As they moved, their outlines dissolved into darkness. When the last silhouette disappeared, the light in the attic suddenly flashed on. I never went up there again. A few years later, I saw him again, a man with black eyes. He was standing at the edge of the cemetery while I was conducting the burial ceremony. When the ceremony was over, he came closer. His smile was as disturbing as it had been then. "The door is now open." "You did a good job," he said. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I thought this man would be the ghost of my dreams for years. But his words gradually dissolved into the daily hustle and bustle of life. The church had its own way of demanding attention. Soup kitchens, leaking roofs, empty collection boxes. I tried to convince myself that he was just a figment of my imagination, the result of sleepless nights and overwork. But something remained. This feeling reasserted itself one winter day. It was a gloomy day that took the last of the warmth from my body. I decided to open the church early, lighting candles to dispel the gloom. The usual stream of parishioners came and went, but she came alone. A little girl, her frail figure standing out against the massive oak doors. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. She was dressed in a pale blue dress, too light for the weather. Slowly walking down the aisle, she entered the confessional almost silently. I followed her, not sure she had gotten lost by accident. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," she said. Her words were clear, as if she had memorized them beforehand, and her voice sounded sweet and weighty. "What sins do you want to confess, my child?" There was a long silence, and then her voice returned. But it was no longer her voice. The words were guttural, like the sound of stones rubbing against each other. "You can't save the sinners, Father. They belong to me now." I wanted to say something, but I didn't have time. Her voice changed again, this time sounding like a child's, with a sing-song tone, as if she were reciting a poem or singing. "But their souls are mine when their bodies die. Their prayers will fade away. Their tears will freeze. For faith cannot save what I already hold. You stand at the altar, you pray and bless, but every sinner you touch will wither away. My chains are strong, my bonds are secure, and I will drag them screaming into the night." My hands convulsively clutched the wooden sides of the seat, as if I were trying to anchor myself in reality. "Who are you?" I barely managed to get out. The girl laughed. Her laugh was sharp, piercing, and not childlike at all. It came from everywhere. "You already know, Father," she answered. And then, as suddenly as she had appeared, the girl disappeared. I got out of the confessional, my legs were shaking. The church was empty, and the girl was nowhere to be seen. The only evidence of her presence was the faint smell of sulfur. A few weeks later, I was called to bless a house nearby. The family, a young couple with a baby, had recently moved in and almost immediately encountered strange phenomena. Doors that opened and closed by themselves. A constant cold draft that did not disappear. And, most frighteningly, the sound of a woman crying late at night. When I arrived, the house seemed alien and unwelcoming. The family looked exhausted. The wife, holding the baby in her arms, explained that the crying came every night at midnight. They could hear her crying, but when they looked for her, they could not find anyone. I performed the usual ritual, sprinkling holy water in every corner of the room and reciting exorcism prayers. As soon as I finished, the crying began. At first it was faint, barely audible, but it quickly grew louder, turning into a piercing wail, rough and guttural, full of unspeakable pain. The sound was coming from above. Against my better judgment, I went in search of it. There was no one in the master bedroom, but the crying now seemed deafening. I was about to leave the room when I saw her. She was standing in the corner, facing the wall. She was dressed in an old wedding dress, yellowed by time, with a torn and stained hem. Through the veil, I could see strands of hair sticking out in different directions, damp and stuck together. I raised the cross and ordered her to leave the place. My voice remained firm, but my hands trembled. She turned slowly, her movements unnatural, as if she were being pulled by invisible threads. The veil lifted slightly, revealing a face that could not be called human. She opened her mouth, but there was no sound. Instead, the walls of the room began to tremble. The furniture turned over, and the air was filled with the smell of rot. I recited all the prayers I knew, my voice getting louder with each word. Finally, she stopped, her figure trembling like a dying flame, and disappeared. The house was quiet after that, but the family moved out a week later. I did not blame them. Later, I experienced another strange phenomenon. The church bell, which had not worked for years because of a crack in rusty mechanisms, suddenly started ringing in the middle of the night. The sound was rough and uneven, as if someone was hitting the bell with force. I grabbed my coat and hurried to the bell tower. The old stairs creaked and bent under my weight. When I got to the top, the bell was swinging, although there was no wind or sign of anyone who could have started it. A figure stood in the corner, his head down, his hands bony and twisted, holding a rope. The figure slowly raised its head, tilting it as if studying me, and then straightened to its full height. I stepped back, almost losing my balance. She made a guttural, inhuman sound and reached for me, but at the same moment the bell rang for the last time, deafeningly. The figure dissolved into smoke, leaving only the rope falling to the floor. Over the years, such phenomena became stranger and more frequent. Each of them seemed like a test that was meant to exhaust me. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened last summer. Late in the evening, when I was locking up the church, I noticed a man at the altar. He was standing with his back to me, his posture tense. "I'm sorry, but we're closed." I called out, but he didn't move. I approached cautiously and, as I got closer, realized that he was not standing. He was floating above the floor, his feet hovering a few inches off the surface. Suddenly his head turned sharply toward me. It was a man with black eyes. "You were supposed to listen," he said. His voice was composed of many voices, as if a whole choir was speaking at the same time. "Listen to what?" I asked. "The girl, the bride, all of them. You think you can save them, but you can't. They belong to me," he said. I lifted the cross, but he laughed, a hollow, piercing laugh that shook the walls. "It's too late, Father. The door is open." And with that he disappeared, leaving me alone in the silent church. But they always come back. I have never been one to seek confrontation. My role, as I understood it, was to lead and protect through faith, not through force. But after this man's words, after I heard the door open again, I knew I could not stay away. What was happening was not just a supernatural trick or a test of faith. Something bigger was coming, and it wouldn't stop until it consumed everything. That night, I began preparations. Exorcisms had always been a last resort for me, but now I could not avoid them. I took out the old texts I had studied in the seminary, but hoped never to use. I asked the diocese for permission. Although they hesitated, more concerned about scandal than salvation, they eventually agreed. The black man's words about the door haunted me. I didn't know what door he was talking about or how it had been opened, but I was determined to close it. I studied every legend, every clue that could give me an advantage. Weeks passed. nights filled with sleepless research and anxious silence. The church seemed darker, its walls pressing down on me. And then, as I had feared, the final battle came to me. It was a stormy evening. Lightning cut through the sky, leaving bright scars. I was alone in the parish house when I heard the main door of the church slam open. The sound echoed in the corridors, accompanied by low, guttural laughter. Grabbing my cross and exorcism kit, I stepped into the nave. There in the middle of the aisle was he. The shape of the demon began to flicker, its outlines dissolving like ashes caught in the wind. But it was not finished yet. With a last, desperate roar, the demon rushed forward, claws outstretched, ready to strike. I was ready for it. In my research, I had learned about the binding ritual, a way to lock a demon in a consecrated space until it could be completely expelled. It was risky because the ritual required the demon to enter the circle himself, but I had no other choice. I led him to the altar, where I had drawn a circle in advance, hidden under the carpet. As the demon approached, I stepped into the center of the circle, holding the cross high. "Come," I called out. "Meet the light." The demon hesitated. Its eyeless pupils narrowed as if it sensed a trap. But his rage outweighed his caution, and he rushed forward. The moment his claws crossed the boundary of the circle, the symbols came to life, shining with a bright golden light. The demon let out a deafening scream. Its body thrashed in rage, but the power of the circle held it in place. I began to recite the final spell, my voice sounding higher than its howl. "By the power of Christ I bind you. By his blood I condemn you. Return to the abyss from which you came." The light became even brighter, surrounding the demon completely. Its form squirmed, shrank, disappeared, as if it were being pulled back through a tear. With a last deafening roar, the demon disappeared, and the rift closed with a thunderous crack. The silence that followed was deafening. The flames on the altar went out, leaving only charred wood and a faint smell of smoke. The church was destroyed, pews overturned, statues smashed. But it was over. The demon was gone. I fell to my knees, clutching the cross in my hands. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to pray not out of despair, but out of gratitude. In the weeks that followed, I worked with the community to rebuild the church piece by piece. Many people heard the noise that night, but did not dare to enter. When they saw the damage, they asked questions, but I gave only vague answers. The truth would have been too hard for them. The man with the black eyes never came back. The gap did not reopen. Whatever doors had been open were now firmly closed, sealed with faith and fire. For the first time in many years, I felt peace. I knew it might not last forever, because evil always finds cracks in even the strongest walls. But for the moment, the church has survived.